She woke up sweating. Not the good kind of sweating, not the kind you get under 3 blankets with a space heater humming. The kind where you kick your feet out and feel the air on your skin and then stop because the air isn't cold. It was January 14th. Outside, Cora already knew without checking. The temperature had dropped hard the night before, somewhere around 9 degrees. She'd felt it coming the day before, that particular dry bite that Ohio winter gets when it means business. She'd gone to sleep bracing for it. She hadn't braced for this. Her thermometer, a $5 hardware store dial she'd zip-tied to the wall stud, read 38 degrees inside. Outside was 9. That's 29 degrees of difference. In a shelter she'd built with no money, no power tools, and no contractor. In a shelter whose walls were packed with something every sawmill in the county was giving away for free because nobody wanted it. Sawdust. Not fancy. Not a product. Not something you buy. The stuff that piles up on the floor like snow under a table saw. The stuff that gets shoveled into dumpsters or blown out back doors with leaf blowers. The stuff that smells like pine and cedar and hemlock and means absolutely nothing to anyone who has a house. Cora Hatchett was 51 years old, formerly of Chillicothe, Ohio. She'd been living outside since the previous March, when the apartment she'd rented for 6 years, the one on East Main with the busted radiator and the landlord who never fixed anything, finally became the apartment she couldn't afford after her hours at the distribution center got cut, then cut again, then gone. She wasn't new to cold. She wasn't new to making do. But she was new to this, to waking up warm, in January, in Ohio, in a box she'd built herself out of scrap lumber and something she'd spent exactly $0 on. And the question, the one she turned over in her head that morning while the cold crept under the door and never made it to her skin, was simple. Why does this work? That's what I want to figure out today, not just that it worked. Why? The spot Cora found was behind a defunct pallet operation on the south side of Chillicothe, a strip of scrubby land between a chain-link fence and a drainage ditch that nobody had paid attention to in years. You know those places. Every mid-size American city has them. The industrial edge, the between places, the spots that are technically owned by someone but watched by no one. Cora had scouted the area in April, when watching was easy and the light was good, and she wasn't yet desperate. By October, she'd already started building. She knew the basics. She'd watched enough, read enough, absorbed enough from the people she'd met in camps over those first months to understand that the single biggest mistake people made was trying to stay warm with heat instead of staying warm by keeping heat in. Those are different problems. Heat generation and heat retention, totally different engineering questions, and most people, even educated people, confuse them. Cora had learned this the hard way. Her first night in a tent, back in March, she'd bought the biggest candle she could find at a dollar store, one of those wide pillar candles, white, smelled like vanilla, and lit it inside her tent and fell asleep thinking it would help. It did almost nothing. The candle put out heat, sure, but her tent was basically a mesh bag. The heat went straight out. She woke up at 3 in the morning shaking. The candle, the tent, the heat going where it wanted, not where she needed it. That's when she started thinking about walls differently. She found the sawmill, Dunmore & Sons, on Route 50 east of town, because she was following a smell, October, late afternoon, driving a borrowed truck to pick up supplies for someone at a camp, and she caught it through the cracked window. Pine, fresh-cut pine, that particular greenwood sweetness that doesn't smell like lumber at all, smells like a living tree that just got interrupted. She pulled off. The mill was old. Not picturesque old, just worn old. The kind of operation that's been cutting timber since before you were born, and will be cutting it after you're gone. 2 men working, a guy in his 60s named Walt who ran the table saw and barely looked up when she knocked on the doorframe, and a younger one, Walt's nephew, she later learned, named Drew who was sweeping sawdust into a pile near the back wall. She asked if they had any they were getting rid of. Walt looked at her, looked back at her. How much you want? She said as much as she could take. He said take it all. We do this every week. Come with bags. She came back 3 days later with 32 contractor bags, black 55-gallon. Walt and Drew hadn't swept since she'd been there. The pile was taller than her knee. She filled every bag she had, loaded the truck and left with enough sawdust to fill a room, which was roughly what she intended to do. Not fill a room, fill the walls. Here's the thing about sawdust that most people don't know, and I mean most people, not just people who haven't thought about it. Most people who have thought about it get it wrong too. Sawdust doesn't keep you warm because it's warm. It's not warm. It's the same temperature as everything around it. What sawdust does, what makes it genuinely remarkable as an insulating material, is trap air. Air that can't move. Moving air carries heat away from you. That's convection. That's why wind chill exists, why 50 degrees in a breeze feels colder than 50 degrees in a calm room, why a fan in summer makes you feel cooler even though it's not changing the air temperature at all. Moving air steals heat by constantly replacing the warm air near your skin with cold air from somewhere else. Still, air is different. Air that isn't moving is actually a terrible conductor of heat. It doesn't carry heat away because it's not going anywhere. It just sits there, neither warm nor cold, a kind of invisible buffer between you and the temperature outside. The problem is that you can't just use air. Air moves. A room full of air isn't insulating, because the air circulates, warm air rises, cold air falls, and that movement is enough to flatten any buffer you were hoping to build. What you need is something to hold the air still, to give it structure, to split it into a million tiny pockets too small to circulate. That's what sawdust does. Every grain of sawdust, every flake and fragment and splinter of wood fiber holds a tiny air pocket against its surface, and those air pockets can't circulate because they're too small and too surrounded by other air pockets to go anywhere. Stack enough sawdust together, and you've got a material that's mostly air, held perfectly still by the wood fiber skeleton around it. The ice harvest industry knew this in 1870. They packed their blocks in sawdust and shipped ice from New England to India, actual ice, across the equator. And it arrived. Not all of it, but enough. The sawdust didn't refrigerate the ice. It just slowed down how fast the warmth got in. Cora didn't know this history when she was filling her walls. She knew it worked because someone at a camp had mentioned it, and she had the instinct to take it seriously. But understanding why it works, that's what makes the difference between doing something once by accident and doing it right on purpose. The shelter she built was small, intentionally small. This is the part that surprises people. They picture a bigger space as better, more comfortable, more like home. And bigger is better for a lot of things. But for a one-person shelter with no heat source beyond your own body, bigger is the enemy. A bigger space has more air volume. More air volume means more air to heat. And you've only got one heat source, yourself, putting out roughly 80 watts of thermal energy at rest, give or take, which sounds decent until you realize that's about what a single old-fashioned light bulb produces. That's what you've got. One light bulb's worth of heat to warm a room. Cora's interior was 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and about 4.5 feet tall. She couldn't stand up in it. She sat, she lay down, she moved in the careful, compressed way you move when space is scarce. The interior volume was just over 100 cubic feet. For one person, and one person only, that volume is manageable. Her body could heat it. But she wasn't counting on her body alone, because the walls were doing most of the work. The structure itself started with pallets. Free pallets, same as sawdust. The pallets stacked behind the farm supply store on Western Avenue that nobody ever collected, that sat in the rain and warped slightly and got partially reclaimed by weeds and were still structurally completely usable. She broke the pallets apart at their nails, sorted the boards by condition, set aside the ones that were too cracked, and used the rest to build a double-wall frame. This is the detail that mattered. Not one wall, 2 walls with a 4-inch gap between them. Think of that gap as the lungs of the shelter, the space where the sawdust would live. She built the outer wall first, vertical boards, gaps between them. She filled those gaps with scrap pieces so it was reasonably solid but not airtight, which she'd learned was actually intentional. Some air exchange prevents moisture from building up. Then she built the inner wall 6 inches inside the outer, same construction. Then she started filling the cavity. Bag by bag, she poured sawdust into the gap between the 2 walls and tamped it down with a stick. Pine and cedar mix mostly, smelling like the inside of a hope chest, that particular drywood sweetness that you don't get anywhere else. She worked through 2 afternoons and 1 morning, filled every wall, floor to ceiling. The wall cavity held roughly 8 bags per section, and she had 5 sections. When she knocked on the finished wall with her knuckle, it sounded different from every other structure she'd lived in. Solid, dense, not the hollow knock of thin plywood, not the rattle of a tarp, a thud, like knocking on something that had decided to stay. The roof was the part she lost sleep over. Not literally, she was sleeping outside while she built, which was its own problem. But the roof was where her calculations kept failing. She understood that heat rises, which means the roof is where you lose most of it, which means the roof needs more insulation than the walls, not less, which is the opposite of what most people build because most people think about wind, so they reinforce the walls and forget about the ceiling. Cora didn't forget. She built the roof with a slight pitch, not much, just enough so rain would run off, and she built it with the same double wall principle except horizontal. 2 layers of boards with a 6-inch gap, filled with sawdust covered on the outside with a rubberized tarp she'd gotten at a job site. The tarp kept moisture out of the sawdust. Wet sawdust loses its loft, clumps together, compresses, and the air pockets collapse. Dry sawdust holds its structure for a very long time. She also, and this was the decision she's most proud of, left a gap at the very peak of the roof, a 2-inch slot she covered with a flap of tarp that could open or close. Not a chimney. She wasn't burning anything. A moisture vent, because body heat produces condensation, and condensation produces moisture, and moisture in a sealed, insulated space is how you end up sleeping in a cold, wet box instead of a warm, dry one. That vent was the difference between a shelter that worked for a week and one that worked for a winter. Walt at the sawmill told her this when she went back for a second load, 6 weeks into the build. She'd mentioned the vent, almost as an aside, and he'd stopped sweeping and looked at her in a way that suggested she'd said something he wasn't expecting. "You figured that out yourself." She said she'd thought about it. He said most people don't. The floor was last. She'd been sleeping on cardboard over bare ground, which worked passably in October but was going to fail badly in December. Cold ground is a different problem from cold air. Ground contact conducts heat out of your body much faster than still air does. You can be in a perfectly insulated box and still lose heat through the floor at a rate your body can't compensate for. She built a raised platform from leftover pallet boards, got it about 4 inches off the ground, and underneath that platform she packed. Yes, more sawdust. She rolled it into contractor bags first, lay the bags side by side under the platform, and then set her sleeping area on top. The bags kept the sawdust from spreading. The sawdust broke the cold path from the ground to her body. The finished floor, by the time she was done, had an air gap between the bags and the ground, the bags themselves, and then the pallet boards. 3 layers of separation between her and the frozen soil. She moved in the first week of November. November was a test, not a brutal test. Ohio in early November isn't Ohio in January. The temperatures dip into the 20s overnight, but don't stay there. The cold is something you can still have a conversation with. But it was enough to tell her whether what she'd built was working. The first night, outside, 24 degrees at 3 a.m., inside she checked her thermometer when she woke up needing water, and it read 41. That's 17 degrees over outside. She lay back down and didn't sleep for about an hour because she was doing math in her head. 17 degrees, from no heat source but herself, from walls stuffed with the stuff that falls on the floor at a sawmill. December pushed harder. The cold got serious, the kind of serious where you stop treating it as an inconvenience and start treating it as an opponent. She had 2 nights that month where the outside temperature went below 10. On both of those nights, her interior stayed above freezing. Not by a lot, but above. She wasn't comfortable exactly. She was warm enough. There's a difference. Warm enough means you wake up cold, but the kind of cold that a cup of hot water fixes, not the kind that sits in your bones for hours. Warm enough means you slept. Actually slept, not the half-awake survival mode where your body keeps jarring you conscious to check if you're still alive. January 14th was the night everything came together. The forecast that week had been honest about what was coming. A cold system dropping out of Canada, dry air, clear skies, which sounds peaceful until you know that clear skies in winter are a heat trap in reverse, because clouds actually hold warmth in, and without them the ground and everything on it just radiates heat straight up into space all night long. Clear winter nights are the cold ones. Everyone who's spent significant time outside knows this. She'd added one more layer of tarp over the outer walls the day before, not because she'd planned it, just because she had it, and the instinct said use it, an extra barrier against wind. Wind doesn't affect the sawdust inside the walls, but it strips heat from the outer wall surface, and she had no reason not to mitigate that. She went to sleep at around 9:30. She had her sleeping bag, a wool blanket she'd been given at a donation drive in December, and 2 pairs of socks. She was wearing most of her clothes as usual. She'd eaten something, not much. That matters because digestion generates body heat, and skipping meals in winter has a physical cost that shows up in the middle of the night when you can't get warm. She did not set an alarm. She had nowhere to be. She woke up, as she said later, sweating, and checked the thermometer and saw 38, and went outside for 30 seconds to feel what 9 degrees actually felt like against her face, and came back inside and sat down on her platform bed and did the math. 29 degrees. She'd built, from free materials and her own thinking and the kind of knowledge you accumulate when the stakes are real, a thermal envelope that held 29 degrees against the coldest night of the winter so far. No heater, no electricity, no money. I've been thinking about why sawdust specifically works as well as it does, and the answer keeps coming back to a property of wood fiber that most people don't think about. Wood is hygroscopic, which means it absorbs and releases moisture slowly, which means it acts as a humidity buffer. When the air inside the shelter is damp, the sawdust absorbs some of that moisture and holds it. When the air dries out, the sawdust releases it. This keeps the interior humidity from swinging wildly, which matters because very dry air actually feels colder than moderately humid air at the same temperature. Dry air pulls moisture from your skin and takes heat with it. This isn't why Cora chose sawdust. She chose it because it was free, and someone said it worked. But it's part of why it worked better than she expected. The other part is density. She packed those walls tight, tamped them down with a stick. Dense packed sawdust doesn't have the huge air pockets that allow convection. It has the tiny ones that prevent it. There's actually an optimal density for loose fill insulation, where you've eliminated the large convective loops but preserved the small dead air pockets. Cora hit something close to that through intuition and thoroughness, not calculation. And then there's the double wall itself. Even if the sawdust had 0 insulating value, which it doesn't, a 4-inch air gap between 2 walls would provide significant resistance to heat flow on its own. Add sawdust to that gap and you've layered 2 mechanisms on top of each other. That layering is what pushes the performance from decent to genuinely impressive. This is why old timber-framed farmhouses, the ones built before the era of spray foam and rigid panels, often have walls that perform better than you'd expect, not because of any specific material, but because their builders understood, intuitively or through experience, that depth and dead air were the things that mattered. A thick wall with natural fill is doing the same physics as a thin wall with engineered product. The physics doesn't know whether you paid for the insulation or found it on the floor. Walt at the sawmill knew this, in the way that people who've worked with materials their whole lives know things without having formal language for them. When Cora told him in February what her temperatures had been, he wasn't surprised. "Sawdust kept the ice house for my grandfather," he said. His grandfather had run a small dairy, had a proper above-ground ice house on the property, packed the ice in sawdust every winter, and the ice lasted through August. August in central Ohio. This was the 1940s, before mechanical refrigeration was common in rural farm operations. Cora didn't know this story. She didn't know the ice harvest industry. She just knew that the material was free and the need was real, and those 2 things meeting, in her particular situation, in that particular January, produced a night that changed how she thought about what was possible. She's housed now. She got a room in a transitional housing program that winter, in February, 2 weeks after the cold snap. She kept the shelter for a while, went back to it sometimes when she needed to be somewhere quiet. She said the smell of it, pine and cedar, always, was the smell she associated with the first time she'd felt genuinely safe since March. Not warm, safe. Those aren't the same thing either, but for one night in January they were close enough. The part of the story I can't stop thinking about is the gap between what we consider valuable and what actually works. Sawdust is waste. It's the byproduct of making other things, the stuff you sweep up and get rid of, the material that registers as zero in any accounting ledger. Nobody sells it. Nobody patents it. No brand is going to put it in a nice bag and charge you $60 and tell you it's an innovative thermal solution. But go to any lumber mill, any one, anywhere in the country, and they will give you as much as you can carry, every week, because they have nowhere to put it. And here's what I keep landing on. The people who have historically known this aren't the people in the industry literature or the building science journals. They're the people who couldn't afford not to know it. The farmers who packed their root cellars, the trappers who filled their walls, the ice harvest workers who loaded the ships. Cora knew it because someone in a camp told her, and they knew it because someone told them, and somewhere in that chain of knowledge is a woman or a man who figured it out the first time, by necessity, by paying attention to what was free and what was cold and what happened when you put them together. The knowledge itself is old, really old. What changes is whether anyone needs it badly enough to use it. She told the person who told me this story, that the thing she remembered most from that morning wasn't the temperature reading. It was what came after. She went outside, stood in 9 degrees for 30 seconds, came back in. And the difference, the physical difference, the step across the threshold from 9 to 38 degrees, was so sudden and so complete that she just stood there in the doorway for a moment. She said it was like the shelter was breathing, like it had been waiting for her. Like the walls, packed with that pale, sweet-smelling dust from a sawmill that was going to throw it away anyway, had decided that this particular morning they were going to do their job. 29 degrees. She'd bought nothing. She'd spent nothing. She'd built something from material that registers as garbage, and it kept the January cold outside where January cold belongs, and she woke up sweating. That's the part I can't get past. That's the part that stays. The thing that worked was the thing that cost nothing. The knowledge that mattered was the knowledge no one sells. And for one night in Ohio, in a shelter that smelled like a pine forest after rain, 9 degrees became 38,